I never expected a single decision made in 30 seconds to change my entire life. My name is Lucas Hale. I'm 34 years old, and I run a small veterinary clinic on Birch Street in Cedar Falls, Iowa. It's a one-man operation since my partner moved to Denver 18 months ago. We had a plan: build the practice together, split the work, grow slowly. Then she got an offer she couldn't pass up, and I stayed because I didn't know what else I would do. The clinic is mine now. Small waiting room, 2 exam tables, a back room for recovery, and a kennel that holds 6 animals at a time. Most days I smell like antiseptic and dog. I don't mind it. I grew up with animals, and I've always been more comfortable with them than with most people. I live in the house attached to the clinic. It made sense when we designed it. Easy access to night emergencies, no commute. But when my partner left, the house started feeling too big for one person. I kept the extra bedroom as a recovery room for animals that needed overnight monitoring. Better than leaving it empty. My neighbor across the lane was a woman named Nora Callahan, 29, an elementary school teacher who had been assigned to Cedar Falls on a 2-year placement. She had moved in 6 months before this story begins, rented the small white house at the end of the lane from a man named Frank DeLuca, who owned 3 or 4 properties around town. We weren't close, the kind of neighbors who wave from driveways and occasionally say good morning when the timing lines up. I knew she taught 3rd grade because she mentioned it once when she came to ask if I could look at a rabbit her class had adopted. I knew she took her coffee on the front porch in the mornings because I could see her from my clinic window. I didn't know much else, but I noticed she was the kind of person who showed up. For her students, for small commitments, for the rabbit that wasn't even technically hers to worry about. I noticed that without meaning to. The night everything changed was a Wednesday in August. I had just finished a late call, a retriever with a cut paw. Nothing serious, but the owners had panicked, and I was locking the clinic when I heard something from across the lane, not loud, more like the sound of someone trying not to make noise while their whole life was coming apart. I stepped out onto the lane and saw it. Boxes, stacked on the front porch of the White House, a duffel bag, a lamp tipped sideways on the grass, and Nora standing in the middle of it all, arms wrapped around herself, looking at her own belongings like she was trying to understand how they had ended up outside. I crossed the lane. "Nora," she turned. Her face was composed in the careful way of someone holding themselves together by force of will. "I'm sorry if I disturbed anything." She said it like she was apologizing for being inconvenienced. I looked at the boxes, at the lamp in the grass, at the front door that was very clearly locked from the inside. What happened? Frank changed the locks. I stood there for a moment. "He can't do that. You have a lease." She gave a small, tired sound that was almost a laugh. "He says the lease had a clause. He's selling the property and claims he gave notice. I never received any notice." "So you're—" She pressed her lips together. Apparently, Cedar Falls had one motel and it was 20 minutes away on the highway. Her car was in the driveway. I looked at it, then back at her, then at my house. I had a spare room. It had a dog in it, recovering from dental surgery, old beagle named Henry who belonged to a retired librarian, but the bed was real and the room had a lock, and it was better than a motel 20 minutes away at 11 at night. I knew how the offer might sound. I was a man alone. She was a woman who had just been locked out of her house, but the alternative was walking back inside and pretending this wasn't my concern, and I couldn't do that. "Come across," I said. "You can take the spare room. There's an animal in there recovering, but he won't bother you. He's very old and very polite." She stared at me. "Lucas, I'm not joking. It has a lock and it's better than driving to the highway at this hour." She looked at the locked door behind her, then at the boxes, then at me. She said, "One night. Just one night." I moved Henry's recovery crate to the clinic. He was stable enough, and he complained only a little, and put fresh sheets on the spare bed. Nora brought in 2 boxes and her duffel. She stood in the doorway of the room and looked at the framed anatomy charts on the wall. I had never gotten around to taking them down, and said, "Very soothing decor." I said, "Most of my overnight guests don't read." She smiled, small and careful but real. I showed her where the towels were and how the lock worked, and said I'd be across the hall if she needed anything. I didn't push, I didn't explain myself further, I just said goodnight and left her to it. I stood in the kitchen afterward for a long time. The house had someone else in it. It felt different, not uncomfortable, just different. I woke at 6, same as always. The animals wake early and I've learned to match them. I made coffee. Strong, the way I'd gotten used to when it was just me. And then I stood at the counter and thought about what I was doing. I pulled out 2 mugs. I wasn't sure how she took it, but I remembered she had been holding a black coffee that morning weeks ago when she came about the rabbit. No cream, no sugar. I put both mugs on the counter and waited. The spare room door opened at 6:45. Nora came out in clean clothes, hair pulled back, eyes that said she hadn't slept much. She saw the 2 mugs and stopped. I guessed black, I said. She crossed to the counter and picked up the mug and held it with both hands. You remembered, it was only once. She looked at me over the rim. That's still more than most people pay attention to. I made eggs. I didn't ask if she was hungry. I just made them and put a plate in front of her. She started to say she didn't want to be a bother. I said, "You're not." She said, "You're saying that to be polite." I said, "I'm not actually a very polite person. Ask my former partner." That made her laugh for real, a short surprised sound, and something in the air between us loosened. After breakfast, she sat at my kitchen table with her phone and laptop making calls. I went to open the clinic. All morning, while I checked temperatures and updated charts and talked a nervous cat through an exam, part of my mind was in the kitchen, listening to her voice making call after call, steady even when the answers kept coming back wrong. No openings, not until October. The deposit is 2 months. When I came in for lunch, she was still there, one hand in her hair, looking at her screen. "Any luck?" I asked. She looked up. "A few places, nothing that actually works yet. I'm still looking." She paused. "How's the beagle?" "He's fine. Complained about his crate all morning." She almost smiled. "Good." "She's a fighter." I said. His name is Henry and he has opinions." One night became 3, then a week, then 10 days. Neither of us mentioned the one-night rule again. There was always something that needed handling first, another listing that had already gone, another place with mold issues, another landlord who wanted first and last, and a deposit she didn't have sitting around. It was easier to keep going than to have the conversation about when. The house found a rhythm that wasn't only mine. She was up early and quiet about it. She figured out quickly that the clinic sounds started at 6, animals, equipment, my boots on the floor, and she adjusted around them without comment. She worked at the kitchen table in the mornings before school and at the kitchen table in the evenings grading papers. She discovered that I kept terrible coffee and told me so directly, which I respected more than politeness would have. She replaced it one afternoon without saying anything, just left a better bag on the counter with a note that said, "This is what coffee should taste like." I kept the note. I learned things about her the way you learn things about someone when there's no pressure, gradually and honestly. She'd grown up in Galena, Illinois, middle child of 5, gone into teaching because she was the one in her family who always explained things to everyone else, and someone finally pointed out that was a skill. The Cedar Falls placement was her second. The first had been in a suburb of Chicago, where she'd felt like one more temporary fixture. Cedar Falls had felt different, she said. Small enough to matter. She'd started to feel like she was building something, and then Frank DeLuca had decided to sell. She didn't tell me everything at once. It came out the way things come out when people stop performing and just exist in the same space. One evening she told me about Marcus. They had dated for almost 3 years. He was the kind of person who never raised his voice and never needed to. He had quieter methods. If she was upset about something, he'd explain why she was misreading the situation. If she disagreed with a decision he'd made, he'd walk her through his reasoning until she couldn't find the flaw anymore, even when she knew something was wrong. By the time she ended it, she second-guessed everything she felt. She'd been working her way back to trusting herself for 2 years. Cedar Falls had been part of that, a fresh place where she could just be correct about things without anyone recalibrating her. I told her I understood that more than she might expect. When my partner left the clinic, I'd spent months wondering what I had missed, what I had failed to see. My therapist had eventually said, "Not everything that ends is a failure. Some things just run their course." I hadn't fully believed him yet, but I was getting there. Nora looked at me. You go to therapy every month? She looked at me like she was recalibrating something. Good, she said. That's good. My former partner thought it was excessive, Nora said. It wasn't just a breakup. You lost a business partner and a life plan at the same time. I looked up. Yeah, exactly that. She held my eyes for a second. Then she went back to her papers. But something had shifted. The particular shift of two people who have said something true to each other, and both know it. Frank DeLuca appeared on a Tuesday morning, 2 weeks after the locks changed. I was in the clinic when I heard a car on the lane. I came to the window and saw him. 50s, good coat. The easy posture of someone who has never had to think hard about consequences. He knocked on the White House as if he owned it. Which he did. But Nora was at school. He stood on the porch for a moment, then looked across at my clinic, and then walked toward it. I went to the door. Mr. Hale, he said pleasantly. He had done his research. I understand you've been helping out my former tenant, I said. I've been helping out my neighbor, he smiled. I just want to make sure there are no misunderstandings. The property is under contract. The sale goes through in 6 weeks. She'll need to be fully out by then. Her belongings are already outside. She has a lease with 2 months remaining, I said. He told me the lease had an early termination clause for sale of property. He'd given 60 days notice. Nora says she never received it. He smiled again. I'm sure it was an administrative oversight. I looked at him. I've known people who smile like that. The smile that knows it's winning and finds that amusing. Is there anything else? I said. He said he hoped we could all be reasonable. I said I was sure we could be. He left. I went to call a lawyer I knew from the local bar association. That evening, when Nora came home from school, I told her about Frank's visit. She sat at the table, and I watched her face do something careful and contained while she processed it. He can't just say he gave notice if he didn't, she said. If he can't prove he sent it, it's not valid. She looked at me. You called someone? My friend Elena, she does tenant cases. She said it's worth looking at. Nora was quiet. I don't want to make this bigger than it has to be. I sat down across from her. He locked you out of your home with no warning. It's already bigger than it has to be. She looked at her hands. I had a landlord before Marcus who did things like this. I stayed quiet. I kept telling myself it wasn't worth the fight, that I'd find somewhere else, that making noise would just cause more problems. She pressed her lips together. I don't want to be that person again. I said, then don't be. She looked up. It's not that simple. Nothing is, I said. But you called me a month ago when the rabbit wasn't eating. You made 4 calls to different vets in the county until someone could see him that day. You didn't decide it wasn't worth the fight. She was quiet for a long time. That's different, she said. It's a rabbit. I looked at her. Is it? The days that followed had a different quality. Something had been named between us. Not us exactly, but the shape of what we were doing and why. We still kept to our separate rhythms, but the space between them had shrunk. I found myself noticing when she hadn't eaten, bringing food without being asked. She started taking the morning animal check with me on weekends. Not every weekend, but often enough that the animals began to recognize her. Henry the beagle, who had gone home and then come back for a follow-up, pressed his nose against her hand every time she came in. She said he was a good judge of character. I agreed. One Saturday morning, we drove out to the county farmer's market. She needed vegetables. I needed to pick up some local honey a client had set aside for me, and we walked through the stalls in the particular comfortable silence of people who have stopped performing relaxed and are actually relaxed. An older woman selling jam looked at us and said, "You two must be newlyweds. Neither of you looks panicked." Nora laughed. I thought about what to say, and by the time I thought of something Nora had already said, "Not yet. Just neighbors." The woman raised an eyebrow and went back to her jam. Nora didn't look at me, neither did I. But I was thinking about those 2 words for the rest of the morning. Not yet. After the farmer's market, I started paying attention to things I had been successfully ignoring. The way she said good morning to the animals before she said it to me. The way she asked questions about cases because she actually wanted to know. The way Henry tracked her across every room. I noticed all of it. And then I did something stupid. I pulled back, not dramatically, not cold. But I stopped texting first, stopped lingering after dinner. I told myself she was rebuilding her life. She was fighting a legal case. She needed stability, not a man with feelings complicating things. None of that made the house feel any less quiet. She noticed. Of course she noticed. Someone who had spent 3 years learning to read the temperature of a room had noticed before I realized I'd started. One evening I came in late. Nora was at the table not grading. She was looking at me. I hung my jacket and asked if she'd eaten. She said yes. I started making something. She said, "Lucas?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "What's happening?" Not a question, a diagnosis. I kept my back to her. "Nothing's happening." She was quiet. "Then you're doing the thing where you make yourself smaller." I turned around. She said, "You've been polite for a week. You're not usually polite. You're usually just there." I looked at her. I said, "I didn't want to make things complicated for you." She said, "That's not your decision to make." She put her pen down. "You get to decide what you do. You don't get to decide what counts as complicated for me." I said, "I know how this could look. You're here because you needed somewhere safe. I didn't want you to feel like I was—" She cut me off. "Like you were what?" I looked up. "Turning a roof into something you owed me." She held my eyes. She said, "You've been under this roof with me for 2 months. Has anything I've done made you think I can't tell the difference?" I said, "No." She said, "Then stop deciding for me." I looked at the floor. She said, "Go eat something. We'll talk when you're not standing there looking like you're apologizing for existing." I went back to making dinner. The kitchen felt warmer than it had in a week. Frank's next move came 2 weeks after his clinic visit. He sent a formal letter through a lawyer claiming Nora had damaged the property, a cracked window that had been cracked when she moved in, worn paint that was there in the original photos, and demanding $3,200 before she could retrieve the remaining deposit. He attached an invoice. Elena read the letter and called it what it was, a pressure tactic. "He's betting she doesn't want the fight," Elena said. "Most people don't. So he gets to keep the deposit, damages, and sell the property without complications." Nora sat in my kitchen reading the letter twice. Her hands were still. That was how I knew she was actually angry. Nora, in mild distress, moved quickly, made calls, took action. Nora, really angry, went completely still, the way animals go still when they've decided something. She looked up from the letter. "I'd like to fight it." Elena said she'd take the case on a reduced rate because Frank's pattern was well documented. This was at least the 4th time in 3 years. There had been 2 other tenants who had settled quietly. There was a third who hadn't and whose case had died in small claims because she ran out of energy before Frank ran out of lawyer. I said, "I saw the window when you moved in. I have a photo on my phone." She looked at me. "You took a photo of her window?" "Of all the windows on the lane when the Murphys moved out and I was checking for damage to my clinic fence. It was just thorough documentation." She kept looking at me. "You're a very thorough person," I said. "I've learned that things get disputed later," she said, very quietly. "Yes, they do." We started meeting with Elena twice a week. Nora gathered her own documents. The original listing photos showing the cracked window. The text messages she'd sent Frank about it when she moved in. The responses he'd sent that acknowledged it without offering to fix it. I gave Elena my fence photos, which happened to include the window in the background, dated 3 months before Nora moved in. Elena said we had a case. She also found that Frank had misrepresented the sale timeline. The property wasn't actually under contract when he changed the locks. He had changed the locks to pressure Nora into leaving so he could make the sale cleaner. That was the piece that turned it from a deposit dispute into something more serious. During those weeks, the kitchen table became a kind of operations center. Folders, printed emails, photographs organized by date. We worked in the evenings after the clinic closed and after she'd finished grading. Henry lay under the table most evenings and occasionally put his head on Nora's foot, which she allowed without comment. One night she was reading through Frank's messages and her jaw tightened. "He knew about the deposit before I paid it," she said. "He already knew he was planning to sell. He took the deposit and let me sign the lease anyway." I sat beside her and read the message. The timestamp confirmed it. He'd gotten an offer on the property 4 days before Nora signed the lease. He hadn't disclosed it. He let her move her life into that house knowing he was already planning to move her back out. She set the page down. Marcus used to do this, she said. Not with money, but with information. He'd make decisions that affected both of us without telling me and then be surprised that I was upset. Like withholding the relevant facts wasn't part of the problem. She looked at me. I trusted Frank because he seemed straightforward. He seemed like someone who didn't have a game. I said, "He doesn't seem that way to me." She looked at me. "How does he seem to you?" "Like someone who's very good at seeming straightforward," I said. She was quiet. I watched her face do the thing it did when she was working something out. Not performing thought, but actually thinking. Then she said, "Yeah, that's exactly it." She picked up the page again and kept reading. I had the particular feeling of having said the right thing, which for me is rarer than it should be. Frank appeared at my clinic on a morning in October. Not at Nora's door this time. At mine. He was less pleasant this time. The pleasantness was running thin. He said Nora was causing complications. He said the sale was delayed because of the legal inquiry Elena had filed. He said if Nora dropped the complaint, he'd return the deposit in full and they could all move on. I said I was just the neighbor. He said he'd heard I was more than that. I told him that whatever I wasn't the person he should be talking to. "This is between you and your former tenant and her lawyer," he said. "You're making things complicated for yourself by getting involved with this." I said, "She was locked out of her home without notice. I let her use my spare room. That's as complicated as I'm making it." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said something I think he intended to be intimidating. He said, "People who stick their noses into things they don't understand sometimes find they've made enemies they didn't need." I looked at him. "I've made friends I didn't expect," I said. "That seems like the better trade." He left. I called Elena and told her about the visit. She said to document it. I already had. I'd turned on the dictation app on my phone when I saw him coming. She laughed. I said I was a thorough person. She said she was starting to understand why Nora spoke highly of me. I held on to that for the rest of the afternoon. That evening Nora came home from school and I was in the kitchen and I told her about Frank's visit. She sat down and listened without interrupting, which was how she listened to most things. When I finished, she said, "He's scared." I said, "Elena thinks so too." She said, "Good." She looked at the table, then she looked at me. "I've been thinking about something." She said it carefully, the way she said things when she'd been rehearsing them and then decided to say them anyway. "About what it means that you're doing this," I said. "What do you mean?" She said, "You don't have to. You're my neighbor. What Frank did to me isn't your fight." I looked at her. "I know." She looked at me steadily. "Why then?" I thought about 30 seconds on a lane in August, about a lamp tipped sideways on grass, about a woman standing in the middle of her belongings holding herself together with precision and refusing to cry in front of a stranger. I said, "Because when I saw you standing in that lane, I had 30 seconds to decide what kind of person I was. I made a choice. I'm not interested in going back on it." She held my eyes. For a moment neither of us said anything. Then she said, quietly, "I'm glad you didn't." I said, "Me too." Something shifted after that conversation, not dramatically, not with anything that needed to be named immediately. But the space between us changed again, became smaller in a way that felt chosen rather than accidental. I started noticing that I paid attention to when she laughed, that when she was tired I could tell from across the kitchen, that Henry the Beagle had started sleeping in the hallway between our rooms. The retired librarian had eventually and affectionately given him up, and that neither of us had said anything about that being strange. One evening in October she was at the kitchen table and I was in the doorway and I had been watching her read for longer than was strictly explainable, and she looked up and caught me. I didn't look away fast enough, she said. "What?" I said. "Nothing," she said. "Lucas." I said, "I like having you here." She looked at me for a moment, then she said, "I like being here." Then she went back to her reading. I went back to what I'd been doing, which I no longer remembered. But the house felt warm in a way that had nothing to do with the thermostat. Frank's lawyer tried one more thing. 2 weeks before the hearing date, they sent a declaration from another former tenant. A man named Garrett who claimed to have witnessed Nora behave erratically after being informed of the sale. Elena called it a fabrication and asked for his contact information so she could depose him. The contact information turned out to be an address that didn't exist. The declaration was withdrawn. Frank's lawyer stopped returning Elena's calls after that. The day before the hearing, Marcus showed up at the school. Nora called me from the parking lot, voice steady but tight. He had come to offer support. He had heard she was having legal trouble and wanted to make sure she wasn't getting in over her head. The language was concerned, but the message underneath was familiar. Are you sure you can handle this? Are you sure you're reading this right? Maybe you should consider whether the fight is worth it. She had listened to him for 4 minutes. Then she had said, I've read the case file 12 times. My lawyer has done this before. My neighbor documented everything from the beginning without being asked. I think I'm managing, he had said. You seem different, she had said. I am different. She had walked back into the school. She called me from the parking lot because she wanted to tell someone. I said, You handled that exactly right. She said, I know. I'm calling because I wanted to say it out loud to someone who already believes it. I said, I already believe it. She said, I know. That's why I called you. The hearing was a Thursday morning. Small courtroom, nothing like television. Nora wore a dark blazer and kept her notes in a folder with color-coded tabs. Frank's lawyer made the expected arguments. Erratic behavior, property damage, the lease clause. Elena laid the timeline out cleanly. The listing photos with the dated cracked window. My fence photos with the window visible, time-stamped 3 months before Nora moved in. The text messages Frank had acknowledged and ignored. The offer date on the property, 4 days before Nora signed the lease. Gloria testified with a thick folder organized by date. When Frank's lawyer questioned her memory, she pushed her glasses up and said, I taught elementary school for 36 years. You think I don't know how to keep records? James Miller spoke slowly about damages that existed before he moved in. He wasn't angry. Somehow that made his story heavier. When the ruling came, it was clear and complete. Wrongful lockout. Failure to disclose material information at the time of lease signing. Fraudulent damage claims. Full deposit returned plus damages. Frank's case dismissed. He left the courtroom quickly, his lawyer behind him. He didn't look at anyone. Nora sat very still for a moment after the gavel came down. I was in the row behind her. She turned around and looked at me, and her eyes were bright, and she shook her head slightly like she was still processing it. I put my hand on her shoulder. She reached up and put her hand over mine. We stayed like that for a moment. Then she stood and turned fully, and I put my arms around her right there in the courtroom, and she leaned her forehead against my shoulder and let out a long, shaky breath that had probably been held since August. I could feel her shoulders drop. The particular release of someone who has been braced for impact for a very long time and has finally been told they can stop. I held her until the breath evened out. Gloria came over and said, That's how it's done, and Nora laughed, which turned into something wetter than she'd intended. Elena was already on her phone. I just stood there with Nora's hand still in mine, thinking about a lamp on grass and 30 seconds and how far both of us had come from that night. We didn't celebrate loudly. Nora said she was too tired for loud. We drove back to the lane, picked up Henry from the clinic where he'd spent the morning with the morning vet tech, and walked to the house. Nora sat on my porch steps, and Henry settled next to her, and she put her hand on his back and was quiet for a long time. I sat beside her. The leaves were going. Cedar Falls in October has a particular quality of light, everything gold and sharp, and it was doing it that afternoon. After a while, Nora said, I want to stay in Cedar Falls. I said, Your placement goes through June. She said, I mean after. I've already asked about permanent positions. There's one opening at my school. I looked at her. She was watching the leaves. She said, I started to feel like I was building something here. I don't want to leave it. I said, I'm glad. She said, Are you? I said, Yes. She turned and looked at me. I said, Very. She looked at me for a moment. Then she leaned her head on my shoulder. Henry put his nose on her knee. We sat there in the October light, and I thought about what it meant to have a life that was mine again. Not perfect, not resolved, but mine and warm and going somewhere. That evening I made dinner. Not well. I'm better with animals than kitchens. A fact Nora had been documenting since her first week with a running commentary that she swore was affectionate. She sat at the counter and narrated my technique, and I argued with her, and Henry watched us from his corner like a small elderly referee. After we ate, we stayed at the table longer than the food required. The clinic was quiet. The lane outside the window was dark and still. Nora had her hands around her mug, and she was looking at it, and I could tell she was working her way toward something. I waited, she said. Lucas, I said. Yeah, she said. I've been very careful for 2 years about who I trust, about how much I let people in, about not letting anyone get so close that I lose myself again. I said, I know. She said, you never made me feel like I had to perform anything. You made coffee and put food in front of me and took a photo of a window without being asked and called your friend about the law without making it into something I owed you. I said, you don't owe me anything. She said, I know, that's the point. She looked up. I'm not good at this part yet. The part where I say what I actually feel without checking first to see if it's the right thing to say. I said, take your time. She said, I think I love you. She said it like a person who has thought about it carefully and decided it was true. Not a confession, not a rush, just a fact, stated simply, by someone who had learned that the careful way was the only way. I said, I think I've loved you since the farmer's market. She said, the not yet. I said, I couldn't stop thinking about it. She smiled. Small and real. She reached across the table and took my hand. I didn't make it into anything bigger than it was. I just held it. Outside, Henry made a small sound in his sleep. The lane was dark and quiet. The house was warm. I thought about the spare room that had stopped being spare, about the bag of good coffee on the counter, about a note that said, this is what coffee should taste like, about 30 seconds in August that had made me choose to cross a lane and ask a question. I thought about the rabbit she'd made 4 calls for, and the way she'd said not yet, and the way she'd held Gloria's hand in the courthouse hallway. I thought about what it means to build something slowly with a person who is also building carefully, both of you watching the other's work and adjusting your own. That's what this was. Not a rescue, not a grand gesture, just 2 people on a lane in Iowa, learning each other's pace and staying. Spring came to Cedar Falls, and Nora's permanent position was confirmed in March. She signed the contract at the kitchen table while I made coffee, and Henry watched from his corner. She looked up after she signed and said, I'm staying. I said, I know. She said, it's official now. I said, was it not official before? She said, it was real before. Now it's official. There's a difference. She was right. There's a difference between something being real and it being acknowledged. Both matter. She stayed in my house. The spare room no longer had anatomy charts on the walls. She'd replaced them with a print of a Midwestern landscape she'd found at the farmer's market. The retired librarian came by once a week to visit Henry. Nora made tea, and the 3 of them sat at the table while I finished up in the clinic. When I came in, the librarian was telling a story, and Henry was asleep with his head on Nora's foot, and the kitchen smelled like tea and something baking. I stood in the doorway and watched for a moment before anyone saw me. This house, I thought, this house has become something. Frank's appeal collapsed quietly in November. Elena called. I texted Nora. Good. She texted back. Tell Henry. I went and told Henry. He was not particularly impressed. But I told him. Gloria sent a card. It said, I'm grateful you both gave me a reason to believe it was possible. I put it on the refrigerator next to the note about the coffee. Nora saw it and didn't say anything, just put her hand flat against it for a second and went to the table. That was enough. I think about August sometimes. The lamp tipped sideways on the grass. The 30 seconds. I've thought about what would have happened if I'd gone inside and locked my door. I'd have woken up the next morning to the same clinic, the same routine, the same house that was too big for one person. I'd have been fine. I was used to fine. But I wouldn't have had this. The note about the coffee, the not yet at the farmer's market, the way Nora holds her mug with both hands when she's thinking, the way she said I think I love you like she'd studied it from every angle and confirmed it was true, the way Henry found the center of gravity of every room and settled there, which lately was wherever she was. The spare room has a name now. Nora calls it the studio. I call it the room with the good lamp. We argue about this sometimes, which is one of our better arguments. Henry stays out of it. He has taken a position of professional neutrality in all domestic disputes, which I respect. Last week, Nora stopped in the clinic doorway on her way to school and said, "I need to tell you something." I said, "Okay." She said, "You never made me lose my voice, you were there." And my voice got clearer. Not quieter, clearer. I said, "That's all I wanted." She said, "I know. That's why it worked." She went to school. Henry sighed from his corner, deeply and with feeling, the way he sighs when something has been settled. I thought he was probably right.